Tonight, the growing pressure for an end to the fighting in Gaza from Parliament, the United Nations and the Prince of Wales. Labour calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire ahead of a Commons vote tomorrow, as Prince William makes a rare political intervention, saying he wants fighting to end as soon as possible. The US vetoes a new UN resolution on an immediate ceasefire, but signs the Biden administration is warming towards the idea of a stop in fighting. Also tonight, the Prime Minister faces the prospect of yet another by-election after Blackpool South MP Scott Benton loses his appeal against a 35-day suspension. Residents facing big increases in their council tax bills as hard-pressed councils raise them by the maximum permitted level to stay afloat. And Rishi Sunak butters up farmers at their annual conference as he tries to win back rural voters. But will he fare any better than previous politicians trying to muck in on the farm? All that and more with Dominic Grieve and Andrew Fisher, who will be with us for the next hour. It's Tuesday, I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. We've had 137 days of the Israel-Hamas war. 137 days since women were raped, hostages taken, children murdered in Israel on October the 7th. 137 days of frightened children in Gaza, civilians killed, buildings bombed. And now, with the planned Israeli ground offensive in Rafah, it feels like we're entering a new stage of the war. It's worth remembering that around half of Gaza's entire population is now in Rafah, seeking refuge. So how has the international community responded? Well, there's been a lot of motions put forward and debated. Algeria put forward a motion at the UN calling for an immediate ceasefire. That was vetoed by America. Then America put forward their own motion calling for a temporary ceasefire linked to the release of the hostages. Here in the UK, the SNP's put forward an amendment calling for an immediate ceasefire. Labour has also put forward an amendment calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. And the government has also tabled an amendment calling for a permanent, sustainable ceasefire. Lots of motions, lots of very heated debate about the meaning of the words immediate and lasting, the difference between a humanitarian pause and a ceasefire. Lots of semantics rather than resolution. And in the meantime, of course, the war grinds on. Well, here is Sky's deputy political editor, Sam Coates.
The royal face of a growing public outcry.
Health system that is totally collapsed.
Prince William hearing first-hand accounts of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. The future king making a rare and significant intervention into global politics.
How are you keeping spirits up in your organisation? How are you keeping people motivated to deliver the support and the humanitarian work you're doing in such conditions?
This visit to the British Red Cross followed a strongly worded statement from the Prince of Wales. He called for an end to the fighting as soon as possible and said that there is a desperate need for increased humanitarian support to Gaza. Turmoil in the Middle East has provoked a political crisis for the Labour Party in Westminster. Weeks of internal wrangling and now a new position backing an immediate ceasefire.
We have set down a motion calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
I'm a bit confused. Are you saying that Israel can't use its armed forces now to try and secure the release of the hostages?
It's really important. A humanitarian ceasefire that's immediate requires both sides to lay down their arms.
I'm still confused. Are you saying that targeted action can be taken by Israel to release hostages, to free hostages, or not?
We are calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire which requires both sides to lay down their arms.
The Foreign Secretary commemorating the war dead in the Falklands. The government says no permanent ceasefire can happen until all Israeli hostages are released.
We think that what we need is a pause in the fighting and the hostages to come out and aid to go in. That should happen straight away. Then what we need to do is to turn that pause into a permanent, sustainable ceasefire. Now, lots of things will have to happen in order for that to be the case and for fighting not to resume.
For months, the two main parties have been in lockstep in their position towards Israel and Gaza. But as of today, no longer. After weeks of pain and contortion, the Labour Party's changed its stance, now telling Israel to stop fighting. A new position they adopted just a day before the SNP put the issue to a divisive vote. And it comes amid signs of a wider shift in the EU and the US and closer to home.
Too many have been killed, said Prince William today, who is planning more engagements to highlight the human suffering caused by this war on both sides in the weeks to come. Neither royal nor political interventions are that likely to change what happens in this conflict. Sam Coates, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, Sam joins us now. And Sam, it's all about a vote tomorrow, isn't it? It feels quite an agonising process for the different parties to have worked out their positions on this. What are we expecting to see?
That's right. Labour has spent, 4, 5, 6 weeks trying to work out what their new position is on what's going on in Israel and Gaza. And we got it today, but I think we really only got it today because tomorrow the SNP are forcing a vote on whether or not to back an immediate ceasefire. And so Labour had a plan. And their plan was to also call for an immediate ceasefire, a humanitarian ceasefire. But that plan is starting to fall apart tonight because, and this has all got bogged down in the weeds of parliamentary procedure, but the government have come in and put their own version of what should happen down. And it's now likely that MPs are going to be offered a choice only between two kind of ways forward, two motions. One is the SNP motion calling for an immediate ceasefire, and another is for a government motion that rejects an immediate ceasefire and instead says you can't have a ceasefire until all the hostages have been released. And so Labour MPs who were going to be given a straightforward way through this by Keir Starmer now won't get to vote for that and will have to choose between one of the two, with the fear being that they go in both directions or all have to abstain. That's a mess. A moment where I think a long-planned decision had been taken to try and clarify things has ended up with the party sort of splitting and going three ways. There's something a bit unedifying about all of this, though, Sophie, because what's going on is this is MPs trying to take semantic positions which, reflect motions and games to try and put political pressure on each other. There's no doubt that what the SNP are doing are trying to put Labour under political pressure here, and they look like they've succeeded. They look like Labour has tied itself up in a bit in knots, because I know that at the heart of the Labour Party, they don't quite know what to do about tomorrow anymore. And as such, this issue, which is about life and death in the Middle East, has become the subject of Westminster Games, and for one political party at least, a big mess.
Sam, thank you very much indeed. Sam Coates there. Well, Sam was talking about the SNP position. We'll be talking to their leader in Westminster in a moment. But first, this is David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. Let's have a little listen to what he told me earlier. Thank you very much for being on the programme this evening. Israel is poised to launch a ground offensive in Rafah. And I think approximately half of the entire population of Gaza is seeking refuge in Rafah. How worried are you about the situation?
Very worried. I mean, look, it's absolutely clear that with 1.5 million people asked to move from the north to the south, with people crowded now around Rafah in effectively refugee camps, that were there to be a ground offensive, thousands more people will die. And as we have been saying for weeks, the fighting has to stop. Too many women, children have lost their lives. Innocent people have lost their lives. The fighting has to stop. The hostages have to come out. We're absolutely clear that the only way now that humanitarian aid gets in and the hostages come out is that we need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
Because the wording has changed a bit, right? You're calling for an immediate ceasefire now. You were previously calling for a temporary ceasefire. What is the difference between those two positions?
Well, we have been saying for weeks that the fighting should stop, and we said that weeks ago now.
So why have you changed the
wording? Let me just say this, that if you went back to the end of October, when Keir Starmer gave his Chatham House speech, he said then that if the circumstances change on the ground, our position would evolve. It's now day 137. The position has absolutely evolved. Over 29,000 people have lost their lives. And we saw the statement from our closest allies last week, from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand. We went to Munich. I went with Keir Starmer. We spoke to European colleagues. We spoke to Anthony Blinken. absolutely clear now that the global community is totally worried at the prospect of a further offensive. But the way now to get those hostages out and the humanitarian aid is that there should be an immediate ceasefire and it should be lasting.
But it's important to say, I do want to come in because, yes, the international community wants the fighting to stop, but there is difference of opinion on how that's done. You know, you mentioned our allies, some of our allies in the Five Eyes, but that is a different position from America. They are not calling for an immediate ceasefire. They vetoed the Algerian resolution at the UN calling for an immediate ceasefire. They want a temporary ceasefire, and it feels like we're dancing on a head of a pin here, but language matters.
I think it's a major...
You think we should go further than what the Americans are calling for and call for an immediate ceasefire?
We believe that the fighting should not resume. We believe that there needs to be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We do not want to see the fighting resume, and therefore we do take a different view to the Americans. But I would say this, it's years since I've seen the Americans strike a completely different position to Israel. So I do think it's significant that overnight the American position has become there needs to be a cessation of that violence and there needs to be a temporary ceasefire. That is a major development in of itself.
You say that you don't want the fighting to resume.
No.
Your motion also calls for the return of the hostages, and it says Israel cannot be expected to cease fighting if Hamas continues with violence. Do you really, hand on heart, believe that if Israel stops fighting, puts down their weapons, then Hamas will cease all violence against Israel?
Well, a ceasefire is, by definition, both sides observing the peace, both sides putting down their arms.
So
that is what our motion calls for.
You believe that Hamas is going to turn into a peace organisation?
I don't believe that Hamas is going to turn into a peace organisation, but let us be clear. We called for a pause back at the end of October. We got that pause, and Hamas observed that pause, as did Israel.
They didn't return all hostages, did they?
Look, let's be clear. A ceasefire doesn't mean peace. A ceasefire means the violence ends and the political negotiations and the circumstances for peace can begin. That's about hostages, it's about prisoners, it's about Palestinian recognition, it's about two-state, and that is why we have a detailed motion before the House tomorrow that I hope the whole House, Conservative and SNP, can get behind.
Yeah, I want to talk about what's happening in the House as well, but I guess what some supporters of Israel would say is, you know, if you're calling for the fighting to never start again, you're effectively saying Israel stops fighting, allows Hamas to regroup, and you admit yourself you don't believe Hamas is going to turn into a peace organisation. So do you think that because of the loss of life in Gaza, it is worth a ceasefire, even if it effectively benefits Hamas?
What are the circumstances in which those hostages come out? What were the circumstances last time? A ceasefire. What are the
That was a temporary ceasefire.
What are the circumstances?
That was a temporary ceasefire. You're calling for a permanent ceasefire.
We're calling for a permanent ceasefire, that is true. What is the circumstances in which we see an end to a conflict that has actually gone on for 75 years, a political solution, two states, Palestinian recognition as a roadmap, and, by the way, Israel meeting the obligations under the ICJ. Those are the things we have been calling for. That gives us a lasting ceasefire. You need the political space for that lasting ceasefire. And at the moment, Arab states, the United States, European others, forming a good contact group to begin the work for that negotiation. That is why we now believe there needs to be an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
You're putting forward your amendment for tomorrow in House of Commons, but it is quite likely that it's not going to get called, right? And that the choice that you'll have to vote on is two very clear amendments. The SNP amendment, which calls for an immediate ceasefire, prioritising protecting civilian life in Gaza, and the government amendment, which calls for a humanitarian pause with the ambition of a permanent ceasefire. In other words, saying that Israel should have a right to defend itself. If those two amendments are on the table and not yours, which will you vote for?
Well, look, the Speaker has yet to determine how he moves forward on the motions before him. Let us wait to see what the Speaker determines. I'm of the view that we don't need a temporary ceasefire, as the government's calling for. I think we need much more than a pause. I think the whole international community is behind the Labour position. And so I don't think that position is satisfactory, although I have seen David Cameron using the sort of language that Keir Starmer and I have been using for the last few weeks. The SNP motion does not mention two states. It does not mention Palestinian recognition. It does not mention the ICJ ruling. It does not mention the diplomatic circumstances that mean we don't get a ceasefire, we get a lasting ceasefire and the fighting doesn't resume. And so I've heard the leader of the SNP today, and the implications are that actually he quite likes the Labour motion. Well, adopt the Labour motion now. Yeah, get behind the Labour motion.
Would you?
The whole House can get behind the Labour motion.
Would you vote for?
And the House of Commons can speak with one voice. Wouldn't that be great?
I get that's what you want. I get you don't think the SNP motion is perfect, but could you hold your nose and vote for it if it is the best thing on the table tomorrow?
I don't want to do anything in an election year in which the Labour Party might have the privilege of serving that cuts across our ability to do that. And if you look at the detail of that SNP motion, it's not balanced. And that is the problem as I see it with the SNP motion.
You talk a lot about a two-state solution and that Labour wants to see a two-state solution. Now, forgive me, because I feel like this is a phrase that a lot of people use without really drilling down into what we mean by that. You know, and it can feel like we are further away from a two-state solution
100%.
than ever, right?
100%.
So who would run Palestine and Gaza in a two-state solution?
Look, I believe that the Palestinian Authority reformed is important at the moment. The leader of the Palestinian Authority is effectively 80. There has not been elections either in the West Bank or Gaza now for well over a decade. That is clearly an issue. But the truth is the British Labour Party and the SNP, we're not in the room. We're not in government. Part of those discussions. Those discussions are going on.
It's too difficult to say, isn't it? We haven't got an answer to this question, do we?
It's a hard question. Of course it's a hard question.
But why can you call... It's difficult. Can we really be saying we want a two-state solution if we can't even lay out the steps? What are the steps we need to get a two-state solution?
We have certainly suggested that you do need Palestinian recognition. That is a Labour Party position. The government don't seem to agree with us on that. Our view is that you also need to reform the contact group of countries that support the Palestinians and the Israelis to get to this point. I think it's very unlikely that we can leave those two to get there on their own. That is part of the ingredients to it. I disagree with Netanyahu. It has to be two states because one state is basically you have to guarantee the rights of Palestinian people. I don't believe he really means that. And no state means you continue with occupation, and that is not acceptable or sustainable. So for all of those reasons, the only way to get there is two states. It's going to need a lot of heavy lifting. It's certainly the Saudi Arabians are going to be essential to that if we are to get there. And I've now met with them on many, many occasions to discuss their views. But none of this can happen until there is a ceasefire. Every Arab state will say that to you. Now we've got over 150 members of the UN saying that. We've got our closest allies, Australia, Canada, New Zealand saying that. That is where we are. We need an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
OK, thank you very much indeed, David Lammy. What's the Shadow Foreign Secretary there? Well, it's the SNP motion tomorrow that has caused this difficulty for Labour. We can speak now to Stephen Flynn, the SNP leader at Westminster. It feels, with everything that's going on in the Middle East, kind of mad to be talking about motions in Parliament, but it is quite important what's happening tomorrow because it's the different parties setting out their positions about what they want to see happen in Israel and Gaza. Just heard there David Lammy. What is the difference between the Labour position and the SNP?
I don't, as I understand it, think there's a huge amount of difference between the SNP and the Labour Party at this moment in time. You know, I've been fighting for an immediate ceasefire for very many months now. In November, the Scottish National Party moved a vote in the House of Commons for an immediate ceasefire. We were obviously defeated. Since then, 30,000 people have been killed, 70,000 people injured, and there's 1.4 million people holed up in Rafah at the moment, which is usually home to 170,000 people. And of course, the Israeli government have stated that they are likely to launch an offensive on that area. This is about the Palestinian people, and we've chosen to use our time to try and be a voice for them, a voice for the voiceless. What the Labour Party have came forward with today is almost an echo of our position for an immediate ceasefire. I'm actually really pleased that they've taken that decision. It's taken a long time to get here. They're going to have to explain to people why it's taken them so long to get here. But it's right that we are now in a position where there appears to be agreement between ourselves and the Labour Party that we need an immediate ceasefire.
David Lammy just said that he thinks you should pull your motion and get behind Labour's motion because he would argue that there are some significant differences in it that means that the Labour motion is able to command more support in the House, calling for the immediate return of the hostages, for example.
Well, of course, the only reason that we're having this discussion tonight and the only reason that the UK Parliament is talking about the situation in Gaza is because of the fact that the SNP has chosen to put forward an opposition.
We'll let you do your victory lap, but
yeah.
talking about what is going to happen tomorrow, would you consider pulling your motion and backing the Labour one?
Well, I think if I was to pull an Opposition Day motion, then there wouldn't be an Opposition Day debate. That's the starting point for this. So the fact that we have used our time to do this is allowing and facilitating that debate. And, you know, I'm broadly in agreement with the Labour Party on this now. Both of us want to have an immediate ceasefire. We can both vote for an immediate ceasefire tomorrow, and let's see what votes come forward.
It feels like there's a real possibility that there may be two things that MPs can vote on tomorrow. The SNP position for an immediate ceasefire and the government position, which is for a temporary pause and trying to find a lasting ceasefire. If Labour abstains in that scenario, what would you say to that?
So of course, it has been suggested to me this evening that the Labour amendment will not be taken tomorrow and that we may well end up in a situation where it is just ourselves or the Conservatives. Now, the fact that the Labour Party have came out today and said that they back an immediate ceasefire is in line with our position, where they appear to have difficulties in relation to the term collective punishment. Now, I firmly believe that stopping people from having access to food, to water, to electricity, to medicines, from being unable to leave an area is collective punishment of the Palestinian people for the actions, the abhorrent actions of Hamas. Now, it would be for the Labour Party to explain why they don't believe that that is collective punishment and why they don't therefore want to vote for an immediate ceasefire. Some of these technicalities will be played out tomorrow, but it will be for Keir Starmer to explain his position, because I think it would be untenable for him to say that he backs an immediate ceasefire but not vote for one.
If the motion passes, calling for a ceasefire, when do you expect that ceasefire to begin?
So what I would expect to happen on the back of that is for the UK to use its voice in the United Nations, to join with all those other nations that have already voted in favour in the United Nations for a ceasefire. I would expect us to use our position on the UN Security Council, because we are, of course, a permanent member on the UN Security Council, to make that view clear, and then work with our allies in the United States to try and force the Israeli government to heed those words. We are a key ally of Israel, and our words matter.
It is. I don't want to be flippant about this, because, I do think it matters, right?
It does matter.
We all see what is happening in Gaza. It's heartbreaking. You hear about the offensive planned in Rafah. But at the same time, I guess what the Israelis would say is that a ceasefire, if they down their weapons, if they stop trying to target Hamas terrorists, if they stop trying to get the hostages back, that effectively allows Hamas to regroup, and they just don't believe that what they consider to be a terrorist organisation is just going to stop attacking them.
And I would view them as a terrorist organisation as well. And I think most reasonable people on these aisles would view Hamas as a terrorist organisation. And ultimately, Hamas need to be defeated. But what we are seeing in Israel is the Israeli government acting without any consideration for the civilian population. And
they would disagree with that, wouldn't they?
Well, they're open to disagree with it, but the evidence is there. We've all seen the footage of individuals walking in the street being hit with snipers whilst walking under a white flag, or people being pulled out of cars, children being pulled out of cars that have been targeted by the Israeli Defence Force. And of course, late last year, we've seen the Israeli forces kill some of their own hostages who were seeking to escape from Hamas. The Israeli forces have a lot of responsibility to protect civilians, but they are not doing so. And that is why we need that ceasefire, so that we can then move to a space where we can create a lasting peace in the area.
If we're talking about lasting peace, though, passing a resolution in the Commons might make everyone feel better about themselves, but it's those really difficult negotiations that are going to make the real difference. I just want to read out the US ambassador to the UN. This is Linda Thomas-Greenfield. She's talking about the Algerian resolution at the UN, calling for an immediate ceasefire, but it's similar to yours, right? And she says, while numerous parties engage in sensitive negotiations, this is not the time for the ceasefire resolution which jeopardises these efforts. I mean, there are negotiations going on behind the scenes that you and I know nothing about. Should we not trust those people involved in those negotiations saying, hang on a minute, maybe there is something else going on here?
I think that's actually quite a patronising position for that individual to take. It's as though the public can't have a view that there's a ceasefire because there's discussions happening. And we, of course, are representatives of the public. The public on these aisles fully support an immediate ceasefire, and parliamentarians in that place behind me across the road should be voting to implement an immediate ceasefire as our foreign policy, which we can then engage with our allies to try and put into effect via the Israeli government.
And just finally, Prince William has come out today. He's calling for an end to the fighting as soon as possible. Now, you might agree with him in this instance.
I do. Yeah.
But, as a Republican, do you think it's appropriate for a member of the royal family to be giving his opinion on such a contentious matter?
You know what? I got asked about this earlier because I wasn't actually aware of it before I got asked. I'm actually quite relaxed about what the monarchy do and don't say. I mean, we live in a democratic society. I think even they would respect that. They're entitled to their views. If William wants to talk about protecting civilian life, good on him. If Charles wants to talk, the King wants to talk about protecting the planet, good on him. Why don't we have greater discourse? In fact, you could probably argue that the King and his son are more attuned to public opinion than the Conservative Party are.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Stephen Flynn there of the SNP. Thank you. Well, the situation in Gaza is sure to feature in tomorrow's papers. We'll have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us will be broadcaster and commentator Ali Miraj and the chief leader writer at The Observer, Sonia Sodan. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, we'll discuss the shifting diplomacy on Gaza and where things stand to stop the fighting with our guests, former Attorney General Dominic Grieve and the former policy advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, Andrew Fisher.
Breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory orders and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. I'm Neville Lazarus and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Hello, welcome back. Well, let's bring in our duo for this evening, shall we? The former Attorney General in David Cameron's government, Dominic Grieve, and the former Director of Policy to the Labour Party, Andrew Fisher. Great to have you both on the programme. Oh, I can't really believe where we are after talking all day about Labour's amendment. The kind of finally Labour getting to some kind of position that all of their party can agree on. It feels like it might not be called at all.
Well, I think that's right, because procedurally this is an SNP opposition day. So you have the SNP motion and you normally have a government amendment to the motion unless the government agrees with the opposition day motion. So I'm by no means certain that a Labour amendment, if tabled, will be called by the Speaker. It's a matter for him, procedurally, but there's no requirement, in my recollection, to do it. You normally have the SNP motion. People can either support it, abstain, or do whatever they like on it. And you have a government amendment, which the government will probably intend to carry, because that's what governments do on opposition days.
I always feel with these stories, when we're talking about kind of like real lives and the highest possible stakes, it feels kind of mad to be sort of bogged down in parliamentary amendments over the road. Does any of this matter, do you think?
I think it does. I think the view that Parliament expresses and the view that MPs express is about influencing the government. And the whole point of opposition days is that other parties in Parliament get to drive the agenda for the day and say this is what we think the government should be doing. And so the form of words around that is really important. But actually the differences between the SNP and the Labour motions, they both call for an immediate ceasefire. They both say the assault on Rafah shouldn't happen. They both call for the release of hostages, and both parties back a two-state solution in their policies. So it seems to me, what really is the argument? If you're arguing over semantics about, the phrasing here and there, it just seems pretty trivial to me. And I think if Labour don't, if you're right, Dominic, and I think you are procedurally on this, and it is a choice, I think if Labour doesn't vote for the SNP motion, it looks ridiculous, especially after Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, said at the weekend that Labour should back the SNP motion before he knew that Labour was going to table an amendment. And, of course, the Scottish Labour conference voted for an immediate ceasefire with very similar wording to the SNP motion, not wildly different, again. So, really, it looks like people are playing games or they're trying to pretend they've shifted more without actually committing. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, but it is, to me, trivialising what's a really important issue. I mean, I would go further, by the way, on some of the motion. I think there's no mention of Palestinian prisoners being released on either motion, either the Labour one or the SNP. There's no talk of an arms embargo against Israel to try and increase pressure, which I think is a legitimate point at this stage. There's a whole range of things you could add to that about the dismantlement of settlements in the West Bank and the continued building of settlements and ethnic cleansing going on in the West Bank. You could mention all these things, but the core points, the core 4 points I mentioned, are there in both motions.
But there's an even bigger irony, it seems to me, because actually I suspect there's probably a lot of cross-party consensus even within the Conservative Party about...
Where are you at on this? What's your position on this?
My view on this is that Israel cannot continue with its offensive in Gaza because the level of collateral civilian damage which will be created if it seeks to pursue its objective of destroying Hamas will become entirely disproportionate to the legitimate aim of trying to get back its hostages and destroy Hamas. And also, I don't actually think Hamas will be destroyed by these actions anyway. It may be destroyed on the ground. They're going to kill a very large number of people, even if they try to avoid doing that. That's the history of all offensives that take place in crowded civilian areas. So that's the basic issue, and Israel has a clear responsibility as a signatory state of observing international humanitarian law to act proportionately. But that said, it's also right to say that it's difficult to see Israel stopping. Hamas have taken civilian hostages, quite apart from murdering and raping civilians. And that is in flagrant breach. It's crime. It's an international crime. It's a crime under humanitarian law. And so the release of those hostages does seem to me to be an absolute precondition on there being a ceasefire, because it's very hard to see how the Israelis can just stop and say we're going to leave these people
there. But it was when there was the ceasefire before Christmas.
Well, there was some release. They
80
started
100,
a release process, but it was a sort of... It was a minuet, if I can use that expression. And actually, I think it has to be just happens. Thereafter, clearly we want a permanent ceasefire because there has to be a peace. And you're not going to get peace without a ceasefire.
We are... I know that all of us, I'm sure, could talk about this subject for the rest of the programme and then some after that as well. But we are out of time on the discussion. And thank you very much indeed. You're watching The Politics Hub. Coming up. Councils across the country are set to hike taxes by the maximum allowed and still cut services. What can be done to resolve the local government cash crisis?
Coming up on the UK Tonight at 8 o'clock, reaction from the families of the Nottingham attack victims as the Attorney-General challenges the sentence handed down to their killer. Valdo Kalakane was given an indefinite hospital order for killing Barnaby Webber, Grace O'Malley Kumar and Ian Coates. Their families believe he should be sent to prison if he's ever released from hospital. I've been speaking to Barnaby Webber's mum, Emma.
If I'm completely honest, we didn't expect to hear that. I think I was feeling so dejected and let down by the justice system in this country, particularly with our case, that I wasn't expecting that news.
That interview in full and much more on the UK Tonight at 8.
Hello, welcome back. Rishi Sunak is facing the prospects of another difficult by-election. Scott Benton, the MP who was caught up in a gambling lobbying scheme, has lost an appeal against being suspended from Parliament for 35 days. If the Commons votes to approve the suspension, it paves the way for Mr Benton's Blackpool South constituents to trigger a by-election. He sat as an independent since losing the Conservative whip. Our chief political correspondent, John Craig, is here. John, what's going on?
He's lost his appeal. I can't recall all these MPs who get into trouble and then appeal. I can't recall any appeals being upheld. I mean, the list of shame, they either go to a recall petition and nearly always get kicked out, or they quit beforehand. And the suspension for him was 35 days. That was the recommendation. Owen Paterson, 30 days. Chris Matheson, Labour, 4 weeks. Margaret Ferrier, 30 days. Boris Johnson was the daddy of them all, a 90 days suspension. Chris Pincher, 8 weeks. Peter Bone, 6 weeks. None of that lot are in Parliament anymore. So, a gambling sting. It was the Times newspaper. He was boasting about lobbying on behalf of the gambling industry and how you could conceal how much all your free perks, like trips to the races and all that sort of stuff, were worth. And so the Standards Committee found against him. The Commons now has to approve his suspension. And, of course, as you say, it triggers a recall petition, which, of course, is what happened in Peter Bone's case. You need 10% of electors to get rid of the MP. In Peter Bone's case, it was 13.2%. Now, Mr Benton, kicking and screaming, wailing and whinging. Oh, it's not fair, he says. The entire process has been prone to regular leaks at every stage, with journalists knowing the details throughout. He also says new members of this committee, the panel, were able to participate in the voting process without having been present for the prior proceedings. Imagine a criminal trial where jurors vote at the last minute, despite not being present throughout the proceedings and hearing all of the evidence. I'm sure Dominic would have a view on that. Anyway, Mr Benton is on his way. Blackpool South, Conservative majority, 3,690. Tiny majority compared with where I was last week. Wellingborough, that was 18,500. All those recent by-elections where Labour's had spectacular wins, and indeed, we should say, the Liberal Democrats have had some as well. It's not really a red wall seat because it was Conservative Blackpool South from 45 to 97, and then Labour 97 to when Mr Benton won it in 2019. Some Tory MPs say this 10% threshold for a recall being kicked out is too low. Well, that's not been changed yet, and he looks as though he's on his way out. And we're in for another by-election.
Another by-election. John, thank you very much.
Fourth this year, it could be.
Fourth by-election this year. I mean, what a headache for the Prime Minister, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the thing is, if you're an MP, you should represent your constituents, not gambling lobbyists, frankly. You know, you're there to represent the people of Blackpool South in his case, and he clearly had a lot more interest in thinking, what perks can I get off the gambling industry? And it's quite amusing to me that it turned out they weren't really that. They were Times newspaper journalists who were doing it. And it makes me wonder, actually, how many people have approached him with similar requests who were from particular corporate enterprises, and he said exactly the same thing, because he clearly seemed very comfortable and very well rehearsed saying this on the Sting. So it's disappointing, and I hope the people of Blackpool South get an MP who actually represents their views, not their own interests.
I hope so too. It was disgraceful behaviour. And his response to the expression about whining about everything that's happened, that's extraordinary. And what does he think about the standards? How can demanding the same as in a jury trial? This is about his fitness to be a member of Parliament. It's been very carefully investigated, independently. It's gone before a committee, and in my experience, and I sat on the Standards Committee, they do act in a non-partisan way, and he's been found to have behaved in an appalling fashion. He's got to go, and he will go, I have no doubt. And I suppose this is just a preliminary, because he apparently wants to stand as an independent, which in the circumstances seems pretty extraordinary.
See what the people think there.
Very strong views on that to our panel. Thank you very much indeed, both of you. Now, to local government finances, something that affects most of us far more than all of the goings-on in Westminster and the news that council tax is set to rise to the maximum allowed nearly everywhere across England. Well, almost every local authority in England is preparing to increase council tax by the most they possibly can do. So figures from the County Councils Network reveals that at least 128 of the 136 councils who declared their proposals say they will increase bills in April by 4.99%. Now, it means the average household Band D will pay an extra £103 a year on average. Despite this hike, councils are still facing a funding gap of £1.1 billion over the next 2 years, so we'll still have to cut local services. Well, let's bring in Dominic and Andrew, shall we? I mean, this is really, I have to say, just looking at what's happening with local government finances, it is really concerning.
It is, but this is something which has been going on for years. Because what really happens is that when central government wants to make savings, the classic thing to cut is local government support. Local government is capped as to how much it can spend. And then the blame gets shifted onto local government. And throughout my time in Parliament, I watched my constituency as the potholes got bigger, and actually some of the basic services could no longer be provided. And there are now many local authorities that simply can only provide their basic services, which they're required to under statute, and even that not very well. So there is a crisis in public expenditure, and that actually widens into a much bigger question. People in this country want reasonable public services, but to afford them, you need a booming economy. We don't have a booming economy, and therefore we have public services which are below standard. How you reconcile that is going to be one of the really big issues at the coming general election, and goes way beyond what's happening in local government. The only short-term solution would be to give local government greater leeway to raise council tax. But then you run in very quickly to the fact that council tax, although I don't disapprove of the principle, the fact that it's now based on calculations which are antique means that unless it's reformed in some way, it has, particularly if you start using it as a major way of taxation, it is going to have perverse consequences. And all this is a mess. And I'm not sure which government has, which party has a solution to this mess. If Labour Party has a solution to it, I'll be very interested to hear what it is. But it's pretty clear that the current government doesn't, and all it can do at a time of relative austerity when the Chancellor is doing his best to rein in public expenditure, because that is what he's doing, to try to boost the economy, is we end up with this. And it is going to be very painful and very unsatisfactory, and people are going to be very rightly very concerned about the level of local services they're getting.
I mean, look, I live in Croydon, where council tax went up by 15% last year. That added 15%
I mean,
last year.
that is a lot.
Yeah, it's a Conservative mayor, and it was signed off by Michael Gove. And the council's gone bankrupt, effectively issued a Section 114 3 times in the last 3 years. It's in a terrible state. It's lost a lot of funding since 2010. I think overall across England, councils have lost 15 billion from central government since 2010, and that's been shifted partly onto the local council taxpayers, but partly it's been cuts to services, as Dominic was saying. And even last year, when our council tax went up by 15%, adult social care was cut by 12 million. They're now consulting on closing libraries. There's been cuts to all local government funding in Croydon, so Mind, Citizens Advice, all those sorts of charities that do important local work all lost their funding. So we're paying a lot more to get a lot less, and that's unsustainable.
The government often says that part of this is mismanagement by councils. I'm not an expert on Croydon, but certainly in places like Nottingham, you look at Robin Hood Energy, where a lot of money was lost. Do councils need to take responsibility too?
I think there's a mix of things. There is one, the cuts to their funding. There is two, the kind of extra demand on services. Look, we're an ageing population. There's more demand for social care. There's more children that need care at the moment as well. That's going up in a lot of council areas. There's also a housing crisis, and that councils have a statutory duty to house families that are in temporary accommodation or not got temporary accommodation. Plus, yes, of course there is mismanagement, just as there is in national government, as we saw with PPE procurement and everything else. So those things combined have caused this. But we're seeing it right across the piece now, and actually you're hearing from councils that are being deemed as fairly well run that they are in crisis now as well. And I think one of the big mistakes that was made, I think, by Eric Pickles when he was local government secretary, was scrapping the audit commission, which was there to audit local government and would have flagged up some of the early warning signals when councils were running into financial difficulties. And that was a mistake.
I think we're in agreement. I share that view. And it is true that some councils have been reckless and are very badly managed. But there's also the truth is that there are perfectly well-managed councils that are struggling. And there is no record of mismanagement. On the contrary, most of them have tried very hard over a long period to reduce their expenditure, to try to moderate council tax increases, but still increase council tax, nevertheless. And they're still struggling. So, no, we are facing, as a country, some fundamental questions about how we afford the public services that people want, but are not necessarily so ready to pay for.
And need, in terms of social care.
They also need,
about
social care, I agree.
People and children and so on.
But above all, the elderly.
And the elderly.
And the elderly is a hugely growing area, there's no doubt about that.
An awful lot of agreements. On paper, you'd think that you two would disagree about loads, but there's been a lot of disagreement on the agreement on the.
So we disagree a bit on the solutions, perhaps.
Well, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, I'm sure that's right.
We need to identify the solutions before we can disagree with them, because one of the interesting things about the current state of political discourse, you may agree, is that nobody is really saying, how do we get from A to B?
No.
Some people are saying how we get from A to A+, but is there, in any political party at the moment, a clear programme of how the UK is turned round and made viable in terms of public expenditure and the multiple needs that are coming down the track, at the same time as being viable economically? That is really off the plate.
More agreement. Thank you very much indeed. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up. After a poll shows the countryside deserting the Conservatives, Rishi Sunak appeals to farmers, telling them he will be by their side. Can he secure the rural vote? We'll debate that next.
This is Vesper. She's a life-scenting canine. She's my canine partner. We come from Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service, and Vesta and myself are also a member of International Search and Rescue, ISAR. She was bred by Westminster Police, and she is part of their breeding programme, so she has all the attributes of a working dog. So she's got mental capacity, athleticism, genetics, everything we want, nice disposition.
Yeah.
But very early they identified that she wasn't awfully keen on biting.
Oh.
So, which might be a bit of a prerequisite for a police dog. So she was quickly moved into Division 4 detection. So she's very clever, very smart, she's methodical, she's systematic. And when that happened, our paths crossed. Yes, she was part of a keen team that went over to support Turkey after the earthquake and Morocco. So we're deployed under UK ISAR, funded by FCDO. And we get deployed to underdeveloping countries to offer UK aid in times of disaster. So she is a life-scenting canine, and what her role is we work together with a team of other dogs, also in a very large team with UK ISAR. The dogs are really critical in their intel to what they give the incident commander. So she will go over collapsed structures, rubble, and she will indicate with a bark indication at orifices or any parts of the rubble where live scent is emanating. And then we can move on and, at a very fast approach, find and identify areas where live scent is emanating so the team can eventually effect a rescue.
It's a very dangerous job, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And the... I know, she looks like butter wouldn't melt here. Yes, it is, but it is risk assessed. And we are all professionals. We are firefighters from 14 different fire services across the UK, trained professionals, and the dogs are a team member just like everyone else who's valued on it. We are now off to the Kennel Club, where the official launch is of the finalists that will be proceeding to a UK vote to vote for the UK's nation favourite.
Yeah.
Vespa's category is Extraordinary Life for Working Dog.
Yeah.
Which I think had a little bit of a twist in it when she didn't like to bite. She likes people.
Yeah.
One of the little phrases that's been coined is she's a lover, not a fighter.
So, and how do people vote for her?
She gets on the Kennel Club website. It'll also be tagged on Merseyside Fire and Rescue. So look at all the worthy contenders, all the finalists out there. Pick your favourite. It's a nice competition. The winners will be launched on Mother's Day in March, and we will be at Crufts. Looking forward to it.
Hello and welcome back to the Politics Hub. Rishi Sunak addressed the National Farmers Union conference today, telling them that he had their back. Now, he pledged to cut red tape and said there will be more grants for technology and productivity schemes. His speech marks the first time a Prime Minister has addressed the NFU conference in 15 years, and it comes as one poll carried out for the Country Land and Business Association by Surbation showed Labour ahead of the Conservatives in winning the rural vote.
Supporting farmers, changing our approach, and strengthening food security. That's our plan. And you can trust us to deliver because we already are. You said you wanted a fair price for your products. Tomorrow, we're laying new regulations for the dairy sector, and we're launching a review of the poultry sector. You asked for fair treatment in our trade deals, so we're standing up for farmers in those negotiations, whether it's with Canada or anybody else. You asked for a fairer, more supportive regulatory system, and we've reformed our approach, cutting penalties for minor issues already down by 40%.
Now, the rural vote can swing elections, but winning over the countryside vote isn't always straightforward. Many a politician has come a cropper down on the farm, so we thought we'd remind you of some previous attempts They didn't go quite according to plan.
Come on, boys, I should have bought you some breakfast. Come on.
I've attempted a bit of shearing in my time, with mixed results. Yeah.
Assaulted by
It feels like the capacity for everything to go so wrong is so high on these publicity stunts. David Cameron did quite a lot of it, didn't he?
He did, yes, and both David and, of course, Rishi Sunak represented rural constituencies. Rishi, particularly, because he has a seat which is almost entirely rural. But there is a problem. My experience is that the rural community is deeply conservative with a small c. So if the Conservative Party is losing them, it's got a serious problem. And I think it's an indication of a complete breakdown in confidence, which comes from a whole number of things, from the government's behaviour, Brexit. I don't think we can ignore that. I think farmers who were diversifying and selling their cheeses directly to retailers on the continent have been unable to continue doing it. So there's a deep level of dissatisfaction. And I think it's the sign for whom the bell tolls. I'm afraid the bell tolls for the Conservative Party at the moment.
I didn't see any Jeremy Corbyn with animals. Was he... Did he go out and about meeting any cows? Or?
He did, yeah. He was in that clip. He was
Did
with
he? I
Sue
missed
Hayman.
it.
Yeah, he
Oh,
was
there
with
you go.
now Baroness
Sorry.
Sue Hayman, actually.
Need to pay more attention.
That would have been
Show
Cumbria,
myself
I think.
up
But yeah, only very briefly. But yeah, he was there in that clip. I was surprised to see him. I forgot about that. But look, I think rural communities are the same as suburban communities and urban communities. Look, they live in the same economy. The economy's in recession. People's living standards have fallen for the past 2 years. The NHS has got terrible waiting lists wherever you are in the country. People are fed up with the Conservatives. The core issues are the same facing those communities. I mean, obviously there are specific things for people who are involved in farming, which is a small proportion of a rural community. But, the housing crisis is bad in rural communities too as well. We shouldn't forget that.
Hold that thought. You're going to have to save it for the Green Room afterwards. Thank you both very much indeed. That is from us tonight. I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. But up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah Jane Mee. Have a lovely evening.